Okay, we're definitely going now. Cool. Yeah, I don't know if anyone is ever going to watch this, but if you do, um, hello. And I decided I wanted to read this after the Why I Left episode on February 11th, 2025, where Dave and Benjamin talked with Dave's students about his piece, among other things, and figured it's finally time I go ahead and read it. There's there's a lot of times where where I have to decide between trying to catch up on TU streams, whether public or private, or doing my own reading, and it's often, a hard choice to make, but this piece comes up quite often, and it's been on my radar since well before finding TU, and so yeah, it's time maybe, and I'm gonna read it now. And I don't have any real introduction or to this piece, but aside from while I'm reading it, I really do want to pay attention to how exactly the Ehrenreichs define the professional managerial class and what class means for them, or what the professional managerial class means for them. And that'll be important to compare to other definitions of class from, like, Marx or many other people, and also compare it to other definitions of the managerial class or professional class, or was looking on Wikipedia a little bit before coming in. There's a lot of different ways people conceive of this thing, like the creative class, the petty bourgeoisie, obviously, or upper middle class. Yeah, everyone has some kind of idea in their mind of what is going on or what's being referred to when people talk about the PMC, and it's usually pejorative. So that kind of gets them a way of understanding. And this isn't new. This isn't new information to anyone who is coming into reading this from Theory Underground. So, anyways, I'm just getting. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start reading. I do I want to read the introduction? I'm just going to go ahead and read the article, and I might come back to the introduction if I have it in me. Here we go. The New Left: A Case Study in Professional Managerial Class Radicalism. Barbara and John Ehrenreich. In the first part of this essay, in Radical America, March-April edition 1977, we argued that advanced capitalist society has So this is immediately let's see. I might this is a bit funny. This is silly because is this the wrong essay? This is a case study. Oh, yeah. This is odd because the table of contents has a different title. This says The New Left: A Case Study in Professional Managerial Class Radicalism. Here it's The New Left in a Professional Managerial Class. So I want to find the first essay. Here we go. Here we go. Yes, this is it. It seems to me. Yeah. All right. There you go. You guys saw me find it, but it's on libcom, so I'm pretty sure I'm not pirating anything. Pretty sure this is all fine. Anyway, it's the professional managerial class, Barbara and John Ehrenreich. To generations of radicals, the working class has been the bearer of socialism, the agent of both progressive social reform and revolution. But in the United States in the last 2 decades, the left has been concentrated most heavily among people who feel themselves to be middle class, while the working class has appeared relatively quiescent. This middle class left, unlike its equivalent in early 20th century Europe or in the Third World today, is not a minority within a mass working class or peasant movement. It is, to a very large extent, the left itself. It has its own history of mass struggle, not as an ally or appendage of the industrial working class, but as a mass constituency in and of itself. At the same time, most of the US left continues to believe, correctly we think, that without a mass working class left, only the most marginal of social reforms is possible. None of these historical anomalies about the US left is explained by the theories to which most of the left now adheres. Orthodox Marxism describes capitalist society as being polarized between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It has nothing to say about a middle class, or, of course, about middle class radicalism. Thus, the left today may sense the impasse created by the narrowness of its class composition, but it lacks even the terms with which to describe the situation, much less a strategy for overcoming it. Theoretical confusion about class is endemic among all parts of the left. Some leftists, mainly associated with the new communist movement, describe students, professionals, and other educated workers as petty bourgeois, though more as a put-down than as a defensible analysis. Other contemporary leftists describe all salary and wage workers who do not own the means of production as working class. The working class, so conceived, is a near universal class, embracing all but the actual capitalists and the classical petty bourgeoisie, small tradesmen, independent farmers, etc. But this group, too, finds its definition practically untenable. In practice and conversationally, these leftists use the terms working class and middle class with their colloquial connotations, knowing that the distinction is still somehow a useful one. Yet this distinction cannot be pursued in theory. The prevailing theoretical framework insists that all wage earners are working class, and that the notion that some workers are middle class is a capitalist-inspired delusion. Yeah, one thing I think of reading this paragraph, there's a distinction, like Dave will make this, and between the industrial working class or the industrial proletariat, and that's a specific thing with specific qualities beyond just the bare, like, because yeah, in one sense you can define the working class or the proletariat as those people who do not own capital and so sell their labor, but then specifically there's the industrial army of that people who work in factories and are working long hours in close quarters together and live together, work, develop some sense of identity and camaraderie based on that fact and the conditions that they're working in together. So I do want at some point to get more serious into going back into Marx and other writings about and figure out for myself like how are they using the work that the proletariat and where this, what can we do with this distinction? But for now, that makes sense to me. That in one sense, yeah, there's just anyone who does not own capital and so sells their labor power for subsistence. And then there's this other sense of the industrial proletariat. I'm going to keep going. When analysis stops, the problem does not necessarily go away. Rather, it is at that point that the door opens to all kinds of irrational and subjectivist approaches. In the years since the New Left in the US matured from a radical to a socialist outlook, the left has dashed itself repeatedly against the contradictions between its middle-class origins and its working-class allegiance. Some pursue the search for a pure proletarian line to an ever more rarefied sectarianism. Others seem to find comfort in the ambiguities of contemporary class analysis, fearing that any attempt to draw more careful distinctions will leave them in an undesirable category, petty bourgeois, etc. At this point, the very emotion surrounding the subject of class provides a farther impediment to analysis. Yet if the left is to grow, it must begin to come to an objective understanding of its own class origins and to comprehend objectively the barriers that have isolated it from the working class. So, Section 1. Classes in monopoly capitalist society. The classical Marxian analysis of capitalist society centers on two classes and two alone, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The other numerically large class of mature capitalist society, the petty bourgeoisie, lies outside of this central polarity and is in a sense anachronistic, a class left over from an earlier social order, which undergoes a continual process of proletarianization, i.e., its members are progressively forced down into a proletariat. Meanwhile, the working class not only expands to embrace the vast majority of the working population, but also becomes more and more homogeneous and unified. You have the As early as the turn of the century, it has become evident that the class structures of the advanced capitalist countries were not evolving along quite so straight a path. The middle classes were simply not withering away. New educated and salaried middle class strata had appeared and were growing rapidly. Most Marxists, however, either ignored the new strata or insisted that they, like the old middle class of independent artisans and entrepreneurs, would become proletarianized. It was left to radical social theorists outside the Marxian mainstream, such as Emil Lederer and Jacob Marshak in Germany, and C. Wright Mills in the United States, to analyze the new middle class. The new middle class is. In these analyses, the salaried white-collar workers were not seen as a single class, but rather as a disparate group, ranging from clerical workers to engineers and college professors, connected to each other and to the old middle classes by little more than a common desire not to fall into the proletariat. By early in the 60s, the explosive growth and continued social distinctiveness of the stratum of educated wage earners had become impossible for Marxists to ignore. But Marxian theorists were not yet ready to give up the attempt at forcing engineers, teachers, government workers, and accountants into the proletarian mold. Pierre Belleville, André Gorz, and Serge Mallet were the first Marxists to chronicle and analyze the emergence of what they called, in opposition to Mills et al., the new working class. The new working class, wrote Gorz in 1964, like the old working class, was defined by its antagonistic relation to capital. Technicians, engineers, students, researchers discover that they are wage earners like the others, paid for a piece of work which is good only to the degree that it is profitable in the short run. They discover that long-range research, creative work on original problems, and the love of workmanship are incompatible with the criteria of capitalist profitability. Despite their immediate consciousness as middle class, the growing body of educated workers are, according to this analysis, a stratum of the working class. A decade later, after the rise and decline of so this is unlike the petty bourgeoisie, who are not workers because they do own their own capital, which they use to reproduce their living. The petty bourgeoisie just are at constant risk of being outcompeted by bigger capitalists because of the competitive advantage that the higher accumulation of capital gives them, and so that puts the petty bourgeoisie at constant risk of failing to continue their profitability and thus being forced eventually to have to sell their labor and become working class. So that this middle class, so-called middle class, or this new working class that people like Gores are describing, are not petty bourgeoisie, because even though they seem to occupy a different stratum, I guess maybe is that the term, they do still depend on selling their labor to reproduce their labor power. I mean, selling their labor power to reproduce themselves. That's okay. So that's the distinction being made by Gores, and then we're going to see what Ehrenreich says about this new working class. A decade later, after the rise and decline of a new left based heavily among students and educated workers, it had become apparent that the gulf between the old and new working classes was deeper than the earlier analyses had suggested. So she's seemingly in agreement with this characterization of this stratum of professionals as being in the working class, but is going to explain that there is still a greater division between them than Gores and all had thought. Nikos Pouliantzas suggested that making a distinction between labor necessary for production of commodities and labor necessary for the reproduction of capitalist social relationships. Thus, according to Pouliantzas, workers in the state and other ideological apparatuses, schools, government agencies, welfare agencies, mass media, etc., must be considered as being in a different class from production workers. In the early 70s, André Gores, too, broke with his own earlier analysis, arguing that it was not only workers in the ideological apparatuses who served reproductive roles, but also the engineers, scientists, managers, etc., in productive enterprises. The capitalist division of labor has been determined by the need to control the workers and the work process in the context of class antagonism, and not only by technological imperatives. Thus, proposed Gores, even at the point of production, a distinction must be made between productive and reproductive labor. Okay, so this is bringing to mind this idea. This was talked about in the Why Left episode and many times before, that the PMC comes in to replace the advanced worker who performs like that reproductive labor even in the context of production, like by ensuring that people are organized, that like that people are that the industrial armies of a proletariat need to be organized such to produce more efficiently, which which they would tend to do on their own, supposedly, because like, well, I'm getting too far afield now, but let's so I'm gonna keep reading, but this is ringing to mind a lot of things. Anyway, so Gores says, we shall not succeed in locating technical and scientific labor within the class structure of advanced capitalist society unless we start by analyzing what functions technical and scientific labor perform in the process of capital accumulation and in the process of reproducing social relations. The question as to whether technicians, engineers, research workers, and the like belong to the middle class or to the working class must be made to depend upon the following questions. 1a. Is their function required by the process of material production as such, or b. by capital's concern for ruling and controlling the productive process and the work process from above? 2. Is their function required by concern for the greatest possible efficiency in production technology, or b. does the concern for efficient production technology come second only to the concern for social technology, i.e., for keeping the labor force disciplined, hierarchically regimented and divided? And 3a. Is the present definition of technical skill and knowledge primarily required by the technical division of labor and thereby based upon scientific and ideologically neutral data? Or B, is the definition of technical skill and knowledge primarily social and ideological as an outgrowth of the social division of labor? This is very interesting, the distinctions these questions are making. And because it's like, what I was trying to point out earlier, I guess, is there's the idea that like the the capitalist doesn't need the that at least in this like early accumulation. I don't know if primitive accumulation is correct here, but at least in earlier phases of industrial production, the capitalist would pay employees piecemeal, like per unit of work done, per widget made or whatever. And and so so the capitalist is not really concerned with the efficiency of the process at this point so much, as long as what they are able to sell the widget for is more than what they're able to pay the worker per period of time required to produce that number of widgets. And in other words, like it was on the onus of the worker to produce more effectively, because then they would get paid more if they produce more in a shorter amount of time. And so in that sense, like, workers had a motivation to organize themselves into units of production that would be more effective and therefore uh, more profitable for the workers. and And so now we can we can draw this distinction then between there, like, well, if you're at work, are you, it's what you're doing, like we can make this distinction between the way people are organizing themselves in order to get this work done, between and then that can be done in order, like, do you want to do it in the most effective way in terms of like getting the most work done with the least amount of effort, or the most effective way in terms of keeping people disciplined and responsive to uh, uh, concern, like to control and like attempts to control the workers from the top down. I'm not being super clear about all this, but I'm sad, so I'm gonna keep going. But there's a lot to think about there. Both Gores and Poulantzas conclude that there is an unbridgeable objective class distinction, as Gores puts it, between professional, technical, and managerial workers and production workers. The problem, then, is where to place these mental workers in the class structure of capitalist society. But Gores, as far as we know, has not extended his analysis of the class position of technical workers any farther. Poulantzas refuses to break with Marx's two-class model, taking refuge in the dogmatic assertion that to maintain that capitalism itself produces a new class in the course of its own development is unthinkable for Marxist theory. Emphasis ours. He ends by lumping the educated workers along with all other non-productive workers, wage earners, educated or not, in banks, commerce, service industries, government, etc., in a stratum of the petty bourgeoisie, which he calls the new petty bourgeoisie. That is interesting. I wonder how he justifies including wage earners in the petty bourgeoisie, unless if they pay, like I guess maybe they pay themselves wages, but that would still be from their own fund, and that doesn't seem to be the case for wage earners in most of the cases of like wage earners of banks, commerce, government. Anyway, we will argue. So Ehrenreich says though that we will argue that the middle class category of workers, which has concerned Marxist analysts for the last 2 decades, the technical workers, managerial workers, culture producers, etc., must be understood as comprising a distinct class in monopoly capitalist society. The professional managerial class, PMC, as we will define it, cannot be considered a stratum of a broader class of workers because it exists in an objectively antagonistic relationship to another class of wage earners, whom we shall simply call the working class. Nor can it be considered to be a residual class like the petty bourgeoisie. It is a formation specific to the monopoly stage of capitalism. It is only in the light of this analysis, we believe, that it is possible to understand the role of technical, professional, and managerial workers in advanced capitalist society and in the radical movements. Okay, so she's about to get into clarifying what I keep saying she. I know this is Barbara and her husband, but we're about to get into clarifying what they mean by class. But so far, we see that the PMC that we're talking about is not a stratum of a broader class of workers, because it exists in an antagonistic relationship to wage earners, as in like the PMC is responsible for maintaining order or directing the efforts of laborers, as the kind of questions that Gores was getting at earlier suggested. And it's not a residual class like petty bourgeoisie, as in the petty bourgeoisie is like those residual artisans and small time capitalists who were just the losers of of the Industrial Revolution. It, that would slowly be proletarianized and fade away like a residue getting wiped up. So let us begin by clarifying what we mean by a class. With E.P. Thompson, we see class as having meaning only as a relationship. The notion of class entails the notion of historical relationship. Like any other relationship, it is a fluency which evades analysis if we attempt to stop it dead at any given moment and anatomize its structure. The finest mesh sociological analysis cannot give us a pure specimen of class, any more than it can give us one of deference or love. The relationship must always be embodied in real people and in a real context. Moreover, we cannot have two distinct classes, each with an independent being, and then bring them into relationships with each other. We cannot have love without lovers, nor deference without squires and laborers. It follows that any class which is not residual, i.e., merely left over from another, like the European aristocracy in the 19th century, can be properly defined only in the context of 1. The totality of class relationships, and 2. The historical development of these relationships. Thus, if we were going to fully and properly define a professional managerial class, we would not be able to restrict ourselves to a picture of this group as a sociological entity. We would have to deal at all stages with the complementary and mutually interacting developments in the bourgeoisie and the working class. The story of the rise and development of the PMC is simultaneously the story of the rise of the modern bourgeoisie and the modern proletariat as they have taken form in monopoly capitalist society. Here, of course, we can give only a fragment of this story. We will focus on the PMC itself, skimming lightly over the complementary developments in other classes. From our point of view, a class, as opposed to a stratum or other social grouping, is defined by two major characteristics. 1. At all times in its historical development, a class is characterized by a common relation to the economic foundations of society, the means of production and the socially organized patterns of distribution and consumption. By a common relation, we do not mean a purely juridical relationship, e.g. legal ownership or non-ownership of the means of production. Class is defined by actual relations between groups of people, not formal relations between people and objects. Right. The former may or may not coincide at any given moment in history with the legal relationships evolved over previous years. The relations which define class, like this is definitely this concept or this aspect of Marx's conception of class comes up a lot, and I wish I could had an example off the top of my head to draw out what's being described here, but like anyway, the relations which define class arise from the place occupied by groups in the broad social division of labor, and from the basic patterns of control over access to the means of production and of appropriation of the social surplus. Two, however, the relation to the economic foundations of society is not sufficient to specify a class as a real social entity. At any moment in its historical development after its earliest formative period, A class is characterized by a coherent social and cultural existence. Members of a class share a common lifestyle, educational background, kinship networks, consumption patterns, work habits, beliefs. These cultural and social patterns cannot be derived in any simple fashion from the concurrently existing relationship to the means of production of the members of the class. For one thing, culture has a memory. Social patterns formed in earlier periods, when a different relation to the means of production, or even another mode of production, prevailed, may long survive their owner's separation from the earlier relationships. For example, the culture of an industrial working class newly recruited from a semi-feudal peasantry is quite different from that of a habitually or urbanized workers. In addition, the social existence of a group of people is determined not only by its experience at the point of production, but by its experience in private life, mediated especially by kinship relations, which in turn are at most only distantly related to evolving relations of production. So when this comes up, I'm thinking of course, like the base superstructure relationship, and maybe I might be off about some of it, but something that, but it does seem like, here that she's making this kind of argument that, well, the that the superstructure is, well, it wouldn't be right to say that she's claiming that the superstructure is not determined by the base, but it's not determined by the base in this kind of straightforward one-to-one strict relationship, because, as she says, that there is a cultural memory, rather like all that the base, as in the social relations of production, requires is that the superstructure is compatible with the kinds of relationships that are required for the reproduction of those social relations. So, like, the semi-feudal peasantry can have that different culture and private life, and they can have that different social existence, but and in their private lives, and that different those different cultures, as long as that doesn't get in the way of them going and to the factory and agreeing to advance their labor power to the factory owner, and so that can leave a range of expression that can be enforced, and that, but it's still uh, she's not claiming that it's not ultimately informed by the base, because like this is a cultural memory of this older mode of production for the peasants. So, all right, we'll just continue. The relationship between class as abstract economic relationship and class as real social existence has been all but unexplored. For our purposes, we shall have to limit ourselves to insisting that a class has both characteristics. A class is both real social existence and abstract economic relationship. Having stated these two general characteristics, we should strongly emphasize that class is an analytic abstraction, a way of putting some order into an otherwise bewildering array of individual and group characteristics and interrelationships. It describes a phenomenon existing most clearly at the level of society as a whole, When, however, the notion of class is called on to explain or predict infallibly the actions, ideas, and relationships of every individual, it ceases to be very useful. Right. Again, getting this, like, kind of attacking this, maybe like, if this is what you would call a naive materialism, or a vulgar materialism, or like a vulgar understanding of base superstructure. Our description, which is not useful, because I mean, clearly we are different. People have different cultures, different ways of cultural expression, and different, like, ways of organizing their private lives and going about their private lives and thinking about themselves and how they represent who they are and what they do. All, like, there's very different ways of doing that, all while still being in capitalist social relations, for example. So, on continuing, our description of the historical experience of the PMC will be abbreviated and episodic, leaving out many key developments in the history of the class. Most importantly, any elaboration on the expansion of the state in the 20th century, and restricting ourselves to the United States. We will begin with a schematic definition of the PMC, then describe the emergence of its distinctive class outlook and its consolidation as a class in the early parts of the 20th century, and finally return to the situation of the contemporary left. Get some coffee and then continue. Two, a definition. Okay, so we're going to get it nice and clear. We define the professional managerial class as consisting of salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. There's a footnote. We do not, of course, mean by culture merely high culture or the arts in general. By the culture of a social group, we mean its total repertory of solutions and responses to everyday problems and situations. This is a transmittable repertory, and the means of transmission may be anything from myths and songs to scientific formulae and machinery. Their role in the process of reproduction may be more or less explicit, as with workers who are directly concerned with social control or with the production and propagation of ideology, e.g., teachers, social workers, psychologists, entertainers, writers of advertising copy and TV scripts, etc. Or it may be hidden within the process of production, as is the case with the middle-level administrators and managers, engineers, and other technical workers whose functions, as Gores, Steve Marglin, Harry Braverman, and others have argued, are essentially determined by the need to preserve capitalist relations of production. Thus we assert that these occupational groups, cultural workers, managers, engineers, and scientists, etc., share a common function in the broad social division of labor and a common relation to the economic foundations of society. I'm gonna stop to pose a question real quick, just because I don't know if it'll still come up in this piece, but this is something I've been wondering about for a long time. Just because I, like, my personal life, like, what are doctors? Are doctors PMC? Or they're professionals or educated? They are wage earners. Sometimes they own their own practices, but, like, and broader than doctors, like, nurses, pharmacists. I wonder about this because my girlfriend is a pharmacist, and like, listen, her friends, her work relationships and work culture is like seems very PMC moded to me a lot of the time. But anyway, I wonder this a lot. What are doctors, I guess medical workers? And so continuing though, the PMC by our definition includes people with a wide range of occupations, skills, income levels, power, and prestige. The boundaries separating it from the ruling class above and the working class below are fuzzy. In describing the class standing of people near the divide separating the PMC from other classes, in describing the class standing of people near the divide separating the PMC from other classes, e.g., registered nurses, welfare case workers, engineers in routine production or inspection jobs of a lower end, middle levels of corporate and state bureaucratic managers of the upper end, we must emphasize two aspects of our definition of class. First, in Paul Sweezy's words, it would be a mistake to think of a class as perfectly homogeneous internally and sharply marked off from other classes. Actually, there is a variety within the class, and one class sometimes shades off very gradually and almost imperceptibly into another. Second, occupation is not the sole determinant of class, nor even the sole determinant of the relation to the means of production. So I get this I'm glad that so occupation is not the sole determinant of class. Like I said, you can be a doctor who owns your own practice or a doctor who works for a wage at a hospital. And that seems like would have an impact on where you fit within class relations. But so what is that? So that I mean that's just saying the same thing. Is that not just saying the same thing? This is not the determinant of the determinant of class is, but what is the relation to the means of production? I thought. Anyways, consider the case of a registered nurse. Or is that is that not what? There's a distinction between class and relation to the means of production because I'm not sure. I'm not sure if something more was meant by that or not, but so I just have to keep going. Consider the case of a registered nurse. She may have been recruited from a working class, PMC, or petty bourgeois family. Her education may be 2 years in a working class community college or 4 years in a private upper middle class college. On the job, she may be a worker doing the most menial varieties of bedside nursing, supervising no one, using only a small fraction of the skills and knowledge she learned at school. Or she may be part of management, supervising dozens, even hundreds of other RNs, practical nurses, and nurses' aides. Moreover, over 98% of RNs are women. Their class standing is, in significant measure, linked to that of her husband. Some nurses do, in fact, marry doctors. Far more marry lower-level professionals, while many others marry blue-collar and lower-level white-collar workers. So there is simply no way to classify registered nurses as a group. What seems to be a single occupational category is in fact socially and functionally heterogeneous. Much of the same kind of analysis could be made of most of the other groupings near the boundaries of the PMC. The situation of the groups near the PMC working class border, we should note, is especially likely to be ambiguous. It is here that the process of de-skilling or rationalizing previously professional tasks into a number of completely routinized functions requiring little training occurs. Moreover, a disproportionate number of people in these groups are women, for whom purely occupational criteria for class are especially inadequate. Despite the lack of precise delineation of the boundaries of the PMC, by combining occupational data and statistics on property distribution, we can make a very crude estimate of the class composition of U.S. society. By this estimate, about 65 to 70% of the U.S. population is working class. We accept Braverman's conception of the working class. Craftsmen, operatives, laborers, sales workers, clerical workers, service workers, non-college educated technical workers. 8 to 10% is in the old middle class, i.e. self-employed professionals, small tradespeople, independent farmers. 20 to 25% is PMC, and 1 to 2% is ruling class. That is, the PMC includes something like 50 million people. The very definition of the PMC, as a class concerned with the reproduction of capitalist culture and class relationships, precludes treating it as a separate sociological entity. It is in a sense a derivative class. Its existence presupposes 1. That the social surplus has developed to a point sufficient to sustain the PMC in addition to the bourgeoisie, for the PMC is essentially non-productive, and 2. That the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat has developed to the point that a class specializing in the reproduction of capitalist class relationships becomes a necessity to the capitalist class. That is, the maintenance of order can no longer be left to episodic police violence. Right. So this is like, I'm gonna get into the PMC as a replacement for the Pinkertons, basically, like that. So the PMC is already parasitic, is like too pejorative, but like it requires like it's a non-productive class. It exists on the margins, like some of that surplus created by the labor that goes to the capitalists, they reinvest that in, or capital has to reinvest some of the surplus into providing for the reproduction of a PMC worker as well. And so like the only reason that would happen in the long run is if it is cheaper, more efficient to do that than to allow the bourgeoisie and proletariat to just continue on antagonizing each other or duking it out like in labor struggles. Historically, these conditions were met in the US by the early 20th century. The last half of the 19th century saw 1. The development of an enormous social surplus concentrated in monopolistic corporations and individual capitalists, and 2. Intermittent, violent warfare between the industrial working class and the capitalist class. The possibility of outright insurrection was taken very seriously by both bourgeois and radical observers. At the same time, however, the new concentration and centralization of capital opened up the possibilities of long-term planning, the refinement of management, essentially as a substitute for force, and the capitalist rationalization of both productive and consumptive processes. In the decades immediately following the turn of the century, these possibilities began to be realized. 1. At the point of production, the concentration of capital allowed for the wholesale purchase of science and its transformation into a direct instrument of capital. Science and its practical offshoot, engineering, were set to work producing not only progress in the form of new products, but new productive technologies, which undercut the power of skilled labor. Labor was directly replaced by machines, or else it was scientifically managed in an effort to strip from the workers their knowledge and control of a productive process and reduce their labor as much as possible to mere motion. As we have argued elsewhere, these developments drastically altered the terms and conditions of class struggle at the workplace, diminishing the workers' collective mastery over the work process and undercutting the collective experience of socialized production. 2. The huge social surplus concentrated in private foundations and in the public sector began to be a force for regulation and management of civil society. The Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations, each worth tens of millions of dollars, appeared on the scene in the first decade of the 20th century. Local governments increased their revenues and expenditures fivefold between 1902 and 1922. Public education was vastly expanded. Charity was institutionalized. Public health measures gained sponsorship and the authority of law, etc. These developments, were of course progressive, in both the specific historical as well as the judgmental sense of the word, but they also represented a politically motivated penetration of working class community life. Schools imparted industrial discipline and American values. Charity agencies and domestic scientists imposed their ideas of right living. Public health officials literally policed immigrant ghettos, etc. Beginning in the 1900s and increasing throughout the 20th century, monopoly capitalism came to depend on the development of a national consumer goods market. Items which had been made in the home or in the neighborhood were replaced by the uniform products of giant corporations. Services, which had been an indigenous part of working class culture, were edged out by commodities conceived and designed outside of the class. For example, midwifery, which played an important role in the culture of European immigrant groups and rural, black and white Americans, was outlawed and/or officially discredited in the early 1900s, to be replaced by professionally dominated care. Traditional forms of recreation, from participant sports to social drinking, suffered a similar fate in the face of the new commoditized and privatized forms of entertainment offered by the corporation, e.g. records, radio, spectator sports, movies, etc. The penetration of working class life by commodities required and continues to require a massive job of education, from schools, advertisers, social workers, domestic scientists, experts in child rearing. As the dependence of American capital on the domestic consumer goods market increased, the management of consumption came to be as important as the management of production. Yeah, this is a big deal, and the way they've summarized, the management of consumption came to be as important as the management of production, because it's a lot easier to think about the PMC in relation to organizing production, like the manager and the hard hat of the factory, or the HR people, but also, yeah, all the work that goes into making consumption possible and desirable. Okay. To summarize the effects of these developments on working class life, the accumulation and concentration of capital which occurred in the last decades of the 19th century allowed for an extensive reorganization of working class life, both in the community and in the workplace. This reorganization was aimed at both social control and the development of a mass consumer market. The net effect of this drive to reorganize and reshape working class life was the social atomization of the working class. The fragmentation of work and workers in the productive process, a withdrawal of aspirations from the workplace into private goals, the disruption of indigenous networks of support and mutual aid, the destruction of autonomous working class culture, and its replacement by mass culture defined by the privatized consumption of commodities, healthcare, recreation, etc. It is simultaneously with these developments in working class life, more precisely in the relation between the working class and the capitalist class, that the professional and managerial workers emerge as a new class in society. The three key developments listed above, the reorganization of the productive process, the emergence of mass institutions of social control, the commodity penetration of working class life, do not simply develop. They require the effort of more or less conscious agents. The expropriation of productive skills requires the intervention of scientific management experts. There must be engineers to inherit the productive lore, managers to supervise the increasingly degraded work process, etc. Similarly, the destruction of autonomous working class culture requires and calls forth the emergence of new culture producers, from physicians to journalists, teachers, admin, and so on. These new operatives, the vanguard of the emerging PMC, are not simply an old intelligentsia expanding to meet the needs of a complex society. Their emergence in force near the turn of the century is parallel and complementary to the transformation of the working class, which marks the emergence of monopoly capital. Thus, the relationship between the PMC and the working class is objectively antagonistic. The functions and interests of the two classes are not merely different. Now, okay, so this terminology, objectively antagonistic, came up in the Why Left video, actually. And there's a comment. Oh no, you guys are going to see my YouTube recommendations. Oh, don't look. If I can... it's not worth... there was a comment questioning the use of objectively antagonistic. And so here they explain that it's objectively antagonistic in the sense of the functions and interests of the two classes are not merely different, they are mutually contradictory. So I in that video I had a comment that I was responding to a comment that was critiquing this concept, and I was trying to defend it, but I defended it wrong. Like, the idea they were talking about, like MAGA truckers have an objectively antagonistic relationship to, the libs, and someone had wanted to criticize this on the basis of, like, no, this is still a subjective determination they make, like, we can't. And I was trying to say something like, well, yes, but like but first of all, you can talk about it being objectively antagonistic in the sense that, like, there's a, because Dave was talking about objective resentment, which is different than an objective antagonism, or at least not. It doesn't seem like it's necessarily the same thing. And so the commenter criticized this idea of objective resentment, and as in, like, that's always a subjective determination when you feel resentment for something versus appreciation, or there's a lot of kinds of mood or of ways you can consider something. But I was just trying to say that it was like, well, that you can consider it objective maybe in the sense that like that the liberal that like the liberal PMC whatever stereotype considers like the truckers' resentment to be not apt, as in like it doesn't map onto anything in that actually into any, it doesn't fit into a situation that actually exists in reality. It's like just a delusion or like a result of them watching too much Fox News or believing propaganda or something. I'm like, well, no, I don't think you could be like it's an objective resentment since that's not true. Even if they make the subjective determination to assent to feeling resentment, but that it's not just on the basis of being wrong or having made an error in their interpretation of the situation that they're in. But so that's objective resentment, and now they're talking about there's an objectively antagonistic relationship between the PMC and the working class, and so the functions and interests of the two classes are not merely different; they are mutually contradictory. True, both groups are forced to sell their labor power to the capitalist class. Both are necessary to the productive process under capitalism, and they share an antagonistic relation to the capitalist class. We will return to this point in more detail later. But these commonalities should not distract us from the fact that the professional managerial workers exist as a mass grouping in monopoly capitalist society only by virtue of the expropriation of the skills and culture once indigenous to the working class. She's saying the PMC only exists because and to the extent that they are they're concentrating the kinds of functions and roles that working class people, that the proletarians would have been doing before anyways, because the industrial proletarians were already organizing themselves into the industrial armies. Like they already, at least the advanced workers, some members of them, some particular individuals within the proletariat already had to be capable of doing this. And so like so the PMC is said to be antagonistic in an antagonistic relationship with the proletariats because like through the separation of the PMC from the proletarian, they take over this kind of function that the workers would have been doing anyways and render that redundant for workers to do. And only by the virtue of the expropriation of the skills and culture. And so not only do they render it redundant, but they workers no longer have this ability and no longer have access to that culture, that cultural memory. Historically, the process of overt and sometimes violent expropriation was concentrated in the early 20th century with the forced Taylorization of major industries, the Americanization drive in working class communities, etc. The fact that this process does not have to be repeated in every generation, any more than the capitalist class must continually reenact the process of primitive accumulation, creates the impression that PMC working class relations represent a purely natural division of labor imposed by the social complexity and technological sophistication of modern society. But the objective antagonism persists and represents a contradiction which is continually nourished by the historical alternative of a society in which mental and manual work are reunited to create a whole people. It is because of this objective antagonism that we are led to define the professional and managerial workers as a class distinct from the working class. I'm not sure what for something they're getting at something by the historical alternative of a society in which mental in which there's not a division of labor between intellectual and physical labor, mental and manual work. Are they, do they mean primitive communism ever as a time, or do they mean historical alternative in the sense of like the historical development of socialism through the class struggle or whatever? I'm not sure. I guess maybe the latter, but I don't. As in like a historical possibility, even if it's in the future. But so we're defining it as a separate class because of this objective antagonism. At least Ehrenreich is. We should add, at this point, that the antagonism between the PMC and the working class does not exist only in the abstract realm of objective relations, of course. Real-life contacts between the two classes express directly, if sometimes benignly, the relation of control which is at the heart of the PMC working class relation. Teacher and student, or parent, manager and worker, social worker and client, etc. The subjective dimension of these contacts is a complex mixture of hostility and deference on the part of working class people, contempt and paternalism on the part of the PMC. The interdependent yet antagonistic relationship between the working class and the PMC also leads us to insist that the PMC is a class totally distinct from the petty bourgeoisie, the old middle class of artisans, shopkeepers, self-employed professionals, and independent farmers. The classical petty bourgeoisie lies outside the polarity of labor and capital. It is made up of people who are neither employed by capital nor themselves employers of labor to any significant extent. The PMC, by contrast, is employed by capital and it manages, controls, has authority over labor, though it does not directly employ it. The classical petty bourgeoisie is irrelevant to the process of capital accumulation and to the process of reproducing capitalist social relations. The PMC, by contrast, is essential to both. Section 3. The rise of the PMC. In order to define more sharply the relation between the PMC and the other classes, we turn now to a closer examination of the initial emergence of the PMC, its ideology, and its institutions. The PMC emerged with dramatic suddenness in the years between 1890 and 1920, a period roughly overlapping what historians call the Progressive Era. Table 1 summarizes the expansion of selected professional and managerial occupations at this time. This is okay, so this table is in thousands, except for total population in millions. So we can see that as the total population roughly triples from 1870 to 1930, engineers go up by 50-fold, or 40-fold, almost 50-fold. Managers 6 times. There's a social recreation, religious workers other than clergy didn't even really exist to a significant extent. Same with a lot of these positions. So the chart shows that there is a huge increase, like well beyond the proportion with the growth of the population. That's pretty clear looking at it. We have already sketched the conditions which prepared the way for the expansion of these occupations. A growing and increasingly centralized social surplus, an intensified struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But it would be wrong to think of the emerging PMC as being no more than passive recruits for the occupational roles required by monopoly capital. The people entering the class in formation were drawn from an older middle class. They were the sons and daughters of businessmen, independent professionals, prosperous farmers, etc. Groups which feared their own extinction in the titanic struggle between capital and labor. The generation entering managerial and professional roles between 1890 and 1920 consciously grasped the roles which they had to play. They understood that their own self-interest was bound up in reforming capitalism, and they articulated their understanding far more persistently and clearly than did the capitalist class itself. The role of the emerging PMC, as they saw it, was to mediate the basic class conflict of capitalist society and create a rational, reproducible social order. As Edward A. Ross, a prominent professor and progressive ideologue, wrote in 1907, after surveying the conflict and corruption of turn-of-the-century capitalism, social defense is coming to be a matter for the expert. The rearing of dikes against faithlessness and fraud calls for intelligent social engineering. If, in this strait, the public does not speedily become far shrewder, there is nothing for it but to turn over the defense of society to professionals. Many people, of all classes, subscribed to parts of this outlook and stood to benefit one way or another from the progressive reforms which were associated with it. For our purposes, the striking things about progressive ideology and reforms are 1. Their direct and material contribution to the creation and expansion of professional and managerial occupational slots. 2. Their intimate relation to the emergence and articulation of the PMC's characteristic ideologies. And 3. Their association with the creation of characteristic PMC class institutions, such as professional organizations. 1. The growth of the PMC. So, yeah, we're going to get into how the progressive movement, the progressives are related to this. Every effort to mediate class conflict and rationalize capitalism served to create new institutionalized roles for reformers, i.e., to expand the PMC. Settlement houses, domestic science training courses, adult education classes in literacy, English, patriotism, etc., provided jobs for social workers, who formed the National Conference of Social Workers in 1911, and home economists, who formed the American Home Economics Association in 1909, etc. Child labor laws, compulsory school attendance laws, factory health and safety inspections, etc., created jobs for truant officers, teachers, and inspectors of various kinds. Similarly, municipal reform meant the establishment of a committee of city planners, architects, engineers, statisticians, sociologists, to plan and administer the health, recreation, welfare, housing, and other functions of the metropolis. At the federal level, conservationist demands, pushed by the emerging engineering profession, among others, led to the creation of federal agencies employing engineers to watch over and plan resource use. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the establishment of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Trade Commission, etc., all in addition to their direct impact in regulating business, gathering information, etc., offered thousands of jobs. Public policy in general became dependent on input from specialists, experts, professors. It is a great thing, exulted political economy professor Richard T. Ely, another major progressive era ideologue, on reading the report of the U.S. Industrial Commission established by Congress in 1898, that there are in this country a body of economic experts, and that the state of public opinion is such as to demand their employment. The rationalizing drive of the emerging PMC struck deep into the business enterprise itself. The early years of the century saw the transformation of the internal functioning of the corporation. The early years of the century saw the transformation of the internal functioning of the corporation at the hands of a rapidly growing corps of managers. Scientific managers, lawyers, financial experts, engineers, personal experts, etc. As early as 1886, Henry R. Townes had admonished the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the source of much early management thought, that the matter of shop management is of equal importance with that of engineering. By the early 1900s, Townes, Taylor, Gant, and the Gilbreths and other engineers were churning out papers on how to rationalize all aspects of a business enterprise. College-level schools and departments of the business administration rapidly appeared to teach the new creed. The American Association of Collegiate Schools of Business was founded in 1916. The managers held conferences, formed associations, such as the Society to Promote the Science of Management in 1912, and the American Management Association, out of several already existing societies, in 1923, and published professional journals, such as Engineering Magazine in 1891, Factory in 1908, the Bulletin of the Taylor Society in 1916. The introduction of modern methods of management was a reform which was understood by contemporary observers to be part of the overall progressive cause. In fact, scientific management first became known to the public as a tool for the progressive attack on corporate greed. In the Eastern Rates case of 1911, the Interstate Commerce Commission turned down an increase in railroad rates after scientific management expert H. Emerson testified that proper management would cut $1 million a day off the cost of rail shipments. Scientific management as taught in the new business schools, exalted reformer and writer Walter Lippmann, would produce a new professional breed of managers who would help lift American business out of the cesspool of commercialism. To the managers themselves, scientific management became something of a movement. In an age of growing achievement in the physical sciences, it offered the hope of resolving industrial problems also through the use of objective principles. For young and imaginative engineers, it provided an ethos and a mission in life. The movement soon became replete with popularizers, traditionalists, and dissidents. After the initial periods of resistance, it conquered the citadels of old-fashioned industrial management in the United States and had a tremendous effect on industrial practice. It had a major influence on the growing reform and economy movements in public administration. The development of a class outlook. From the beginning, the nascent PMC possessed a class outlook which is distinct from, and often antagonistic to, that of the capitalist class. It is true that, with hindsight, one is struck by the ultimate concordance of interests between the two classes. Even at that time, New Republic editor Herbert Croly noted that progressivism was designed to serve as a counterpoise to the threat of working-class revolution. And a wealthy philanthropist friend of Jane Addams noted appreciatively that Addams was really an interpreter between working men and the people who lived in luxury on the other side of the city. And she also gave the people of her neighborhood quite a different idea about the men and women who were ordinarily called capitalists. Class harmony was the stated goal of many outstanding PMC spokespeople. and to many in the capitalist class as well, it was clear that professionals could be more effective in the long run than Pinkertons. But the PMC was not merely a class of lackeys. The capitalists fought vigorously to block or modify those PMC-supported reforms which they saw as threatening their interests. As for the PMC, the very ideals of objectivity, rationality, etc., which justified their role to the capitalists, inevitably led them into conflict with the capitalists. For one thing, the roles of the PMC was entering and carving out for itself as technical innovators, social mediators, culture producers, etc., required a high degree of autonomy, if only for the sake of legitimization. Claims to objectivity cannot be made from an objective position of servility. The conflict over occupational autonomy was particularly visible in the universities. The enormous expansion of higher education in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century had been underwritten by men like John Hopkins, Leland Stanford, and above all, John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Battles over academic freedom often brought faculty into direct confrontation with capitalist trustees, with the professors asserting their autonomy as experts. But the conflict between the PMC and the capitalist class went deeper than the issue of occupational autonomy. Early PMC leaders envisioned a technocratic transformation of society in which all aspects of life would be rationalized according to expert knowledge. For example, Frederick Winslow Taylor, the leader of the movement for scientific management, saw scientific management as much more than a set of techniques to streamline production. The same principles can be applied with equal force to all social activities, to the management of our tradesmen, large and small, of our churches, our philanthropic institutions, our universities, and our governmental departments. What other reforms could do as much toward promoting prosperity, toward the diminution of poverty, and the alleviation of suffering? Or, as E.D. Meyer, the president of the American Society of Mining Engineers, put it in 1911, the golden rule will be put into practice through the slide rule of the engineer. Of course, efficiency, order, and rationality are not in themselves capitalist goals. Even scientific management met with initial resistance from many in the business community who saw it as a potential threat to their own autonomy from outside surveillance. Scientific management, as already mentioned, was originally popularized as a tool for the public to use to judge the fairness of corporate prices. Engineers, perhaps, because of their workaday intimacy with capitalist concerns, often saw the recalcitrance of capital most clearly. To give a trivial but telling example, in 1902 and again in 1906, efforts of reform-minded engineers to get the American Society of Mechanical Engineers to support the campaign for conversion to the metric system were defeated by capitalist opposition. Most capital equipment was already calibrated in English units. The businessman is the master, the engineer is his good slave, complained a writer in the Engineering News of 1904. One of these continual skirmishes over academic freedom, progressive reforms, consumer issues, etc., many in the PMC were led to more systematic anti-capitalist outlooks. One widely publicized variety of PMC anti-capitalism was that represented by Thorstein Veblen's technocratic critique. Veblen portrayed the contemporary capitalists as a parasitical class no less decadent than the European aristocracy. The captains of industry, he argued, have always turned the technologists and their knowledge to account, only so far as would serve their own commercial profit, not to the extent of their ability, or to the limits set by the material circumstances, or by the needs of the community. To do their work as it should be done, these men of the industrial general staff, i.e., engineers and managers, must have a free hand, unhampered by commercial considerations and reservations, It is an open secret that with a reasonably free hand, the production experts would today readily increase the ordinary output of industry by several fold, variously estimated at some 300% to 1200% of the current output. And what stands in the way of so increasing the ordinary output of goods and services is business as usual. Progress demanded that the capitalists be swept away to make room, not for the working class, but for the rising class of experts. But Veblen's vision of a technocracy, a government by the experts, smacked too overtly of PMC self-interest to gain a wide following, even within the class. In fact, Edward Ross, who in 1907 had himself called for extensive social engineering, was moved to write, somewhat defensively, in 1920. There is, of course, no such thing as government by experts. The malicious phrase is but a sneer flung by the scheming self-seekers who find in the relentless veracity of modestly paid trained investigators a barrier across their path. The strongest expression of PMC anti-capitalist ideology was to be found in the explicit socialist politics, which in the early 20th century United States meant the Socialist Party. In the United States, probably more than anywhere else, socialism is recruiting heavily from the better classes of society, boasted party leader Morris Hillquit in 1907. Although the party had a large working-class membership and people we would identify as members of the PMC were clearly a minority in the party as a whole, most of the top leadership and a vastly disproportionate part of the membership were engaged in PMC and old middle-class occupations, or had been so engaged before assuming full-time party duties. In fact, socialism, as articulated by the pre-World War I Socialist Party, was frequently not far from the PMC's technocratic vision. Socialism meant government ownership of the means of production, which would still be administered by experts, and expansion of government social services, which would still be supplied by professionals, or intellectual proletarians, as Hillquit called them. Socialism in this version forms a continuum with non-socialist progressivism. Party leader William Ghent even complained that Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 Progressive Party platform, a platform designed to attract the middle-class reform vote without fundamentally upsetting capitalist priorities, begins its program with the brazen theft of half the working class of the Socialist Party. Half the working program of the Socialist Party. On the right wing of the party, even such traditional socialist notions as class struggle were considered too radical and were replaced by progressive ideals of class conciliation. Class hatred, wrote writer, social worker, and party national executive member John Spargo, was a monstrous thing to be abhorred by all right-thinking men and women. 3. The consolidation of the professional managerial class. In the period up to mid-century, professional managerial occupations expanded much more rapidly than the workforce as a whole. The people filling these occupations and their families came more and more to constitute a socially coherent class. Collectively, the PMC consolidated its cultural hegemony over the working class as the army of counselors, psychologists, teachers, etc. swelled from the 20s on. But the early PMC's radical dream of a technocratic society was not, of course, to be realized. To the extent that the PMC established itself as a major class in 20th century American society, it did so on terms set by the capitalist class. Individually, many PMC members scaled the highest pinnacles of power, either to bask there temporarily as consultants and advisors, or to remain as permanent members of the ruling class. Acceptance came gradually. Self-made capitalists like Andrew Carnegie initially had little use for experts and college men in their enterprises. But by the teens, experts, college professors, researchers, PMC civic reformers had become indispensable and routine members of the boards of trustees of key capitalist-sponsored institutions, replacing the token clergymen of an earlier era. In 1918, when President Wilson went off to the peace conference in Paris, he publicly acknowledged the importance of the PMC by taking along with him a grand conclave of expert advisors from several fields of knowledge, which was known to contemporaries as the inquiry. Within industry, as the size and complexity of corporations increased, PMC occupations such as engineering, law, and financial management became recruiting grounds for top management, i.e., into the ruling class itself. For the great majority of the members of the PMC, however, the only guarantee of security, never mind autonomous power, lay in collective action. The characteristic form of self-organization of the PMC was the profession. The defining characteristics of professions should be seen as representing simultaneously both the aspirations of the PMC and the claims which are necessary to justify those aspirations to the other classes of capitalist society. These characteristics are, in brief, a. The existence of a specialized body of knowledge accessible only by lengthy training. B. The existence of ethical standards which include a commitment to public service. And C. A measure of autonomy from outside interference in the practice of a profession, e.g., only members of the profession can judge the value of a fellow professional's work. The claims to specialized knowledge and ethical standards serve to justify the bid for autonomy, which is most commonly directed to the capitalist employing class. Furthermore, the possession or claim to possession of specialized knowledge ensures that the PMC can control its own reproduction as a class. Lengthy training has barred working class entrance to the professions and given a decided advantage to the children of the PMC itself. The claim to high ethical standards represents the PMC's persistent reassurance that its class interests are identical to the interests of society at large. Finally, all three characteristics of professions are aimed at ensuring that the relationship between the individual profession and his or her client, that is, student or patient, is one of benign domination. So I want to read the three characteristics one more time. The existence of a specialized body of knowledge accessible only by lengthy training. The existence of ethical standards, which include a commitment to public service and a measure of autonomy from outside interference in the practice of the profession. Between the 1880s and 1920, medicine, law, social work, engineering, and teaching emerged in their modern form, complete with professional organizations and journals and legally enforced criteria for admissions, i.e., accrediting of training institutions and or licensing of individual practitioners. At the same time, the learned professions were sorting themselves out and taking organizational form. Natural philosophy subdivided into the modern natural sciences. Psychology detached itself from philosophy. Sociology, history, and political science began to go their separate ways, etc. The device of professionalism was not universally or uniformly successful. Some occupations, like nursing, are professions more out of courtesy than social reality. Other, more clearly PMC occupations, such as engineering, can hardly claim to have a professional degree of autonomy. Between 1900 and 1920, Many of the U.S. engineering societies were torn by struggles between professional-minded engineers who saw themselves as professionals first and employees second, and business-oriented engineers, whose first loyalty was to their employing industry. The business-oriented faction triumphed for the most part, even going so far as to permit untrained businessmen to join the engineers' professional societies. From the perspective of the entire class, professionalism had an inherent disadvantage as a strategy for class advancement. Specialization was the PMC member's chief selling point, the quality which justifies his or her claim to a unique niche in society, but it acted as a centrifugal force on the class as a whole. Consider that in 1900 a scholar such as William James could flit from teaching physiology to psychology and finally to philosophy without unduly discomfiting the Harvard administration. And in 1919, Veblen in Engineers in the Price System could still lump together engineers and all sorts of managers and administrators under the common rubric engineer. But by mid-century, the class was so minutely splintered that even terms such as scientist or engineer no longer signified groups with common workplace concerns or even a common language. The deepest rift overriding the petty occupational subspecializations was the one which developed between the managers, administrators, and engineers on one hand, and those in the liberal arts and service professions on the other. The material difference between the two groups was that those in the first category are directly tied to business and industry, for jobs are, not infrequently, way stations on the road into the ruling class itself. Those in the second category are more likely to enjoy the relative shelter of the university or other sorts of non-profit agencies and to be firmly fixed within the PMC. Along with this difference in apparent sources of subsidy went a difference in general political outlook. The managerial technical community came to pride itself on its hard-headedness and even on its indifference to the social consequences of its labor, i.e., its helplessness. The second group, those in the more liberal pursuits, became the only repository of the traditional PMC antagonism to capital. Managers and engineers on the one side, liberal academics on the other, came to view each other across a gulf of distrust and contempt. But we should not overestimate the significance of this division. The PMC at mid-century still constituted a single coherent class. The actual employment experience and social attitudes of managers and engineers and those in the liberal professions are hardly more divergent than those of such working class groups as, say, clerical workers and steel workers. The image of non-managerial professionals as ivory tower-bound, somewhat impractical intellectuals has little counterpart in reality. "70% of the country's scientists and engineers are employed in business and industry. Half the rest are in government. Even leaving out the engineers, only 1/5 of the physicists and 2/5 of the life scientists are employed by universities. Well under half of the professionals and scientific workers in all fields, including the social sciences, are employed by educational and other non-profit institutions. In the business and governmental organizations which employ most professionals, the professional typically is employed in a managerial or semi-managerial role. As for the minority of professionals who are in academic and similar institutions, they are hardly aloof from what C. Wright Mills called the managerial demiurge. They greedily accept consulting positions with industry and government. And within their institutions, they take on a variety of managerial and administrative functions, administering grants, supervising research and teaching assistants, running departments and institutions. The image of the corporate middle manager as completely divorced from the academic world is equally overdrawn. Over 80% of corporate managers at all levels in large corporations have college training or graduate training. 80% surprisingly low. I think it would be like 95% today, if not higher. Like, um, about half in the liberal arts, the rest divided equally between engineering and business. Professional graduate training in law, engineering, or business schools, which correctly tell their students that they are being trained in applied social science, more and more becomes a prerequisite for advancement on the management ladder. Um, I'm getting sleepy. I did not get enough sleep last night, but it looks like there's just 1.5 more pages. So I'm going to power through. Moreover, the various groups within the PMC are socially coherent. Paul Sweezy has argued that the basic test of whether two families belong to the same class or not is the freedom with which they intermarry. The children of PMC members do overwhelmingly tend to marry within the class. Marriage down to the working class or up to the ruling class is comparatively infrequent. In line with the frequency of intermarriage, the class exhibits a substantial degree of intergenerational stability. Children of PMC families are more than twice as likely as children of working class families to themselves enter PMC occupations. Moreover, the class is characterized by a common culture or lifestyle. The interior life of the class is shaped by the problem of class reproduction. Unlike ruling class occupations, PMC occupations are never directly hereditary. The son of the chairman of the board may expect to become a successful businessman, or at least a wealthy one, more or less by growing up. The son of a research scientist knows he can only hope to achieve a similar position through continuous effort. Traditionally, much of this effort has come from the women of the class. Since, according to psychologists, a child's future achievement is determined by the nuances of its early upbringing, women of the class have been expected to stay home and specialize in child raising. So this is like distinct from ruling class people who hire nannies and nurses and working class people who both parents work. Both sexes, however, are expected to perform well in school and attend good colleges, for it is at college that young men acquire the credentials for full class membership, and young women acquire, in addition to their own degrees, credentialed husbands. As a result of the anxiety about class reproduction, all of the ordinary experiences of life, growing up and giving birth, child raising, are frightened with an external significance unknown in other classes. Private life thus becomes too arduous to be lived in private. The inner life of the PMC must be continuously shaped, updated, and revised by, of course, ever-mounting numbers of experts. Experts in child raising, family living, sexual fulfillment, self-realization, etc., etc. The very insecurity of the class, then, provides new ground for class expansion. By mid-century, the PMC was successful enough to provide a new mass market for many of its own services, and unsuccessful enough to need them. Excuse me. In the second part of this essay, we will discuss the growth of the PMC and its institutions in the 60s. We will use a theoretical framework we have developed here to analyze the emergence and history of a new left, based in the PMC, including students, the PMC, and training. Finally, we will discuss the subjective relationships existing today between the PMC and the working class, and we will try to draw from this some strategic implications for the left. Okay, and there we go. I am ending it here.